In August of 2026, an 82-year-old man sat down for another interview about his daughter. He has done this more times than anyone could count over the last 3 decades, and yet reporters still say the same thing after every conversation with him. He seems different this time, more urgent, less guarded. Almost, some say, like a man who believes he is finally running out of time to hear the one answer he has spent nearly 30 years chasing. That man is John Ramsey. His daughter was JonBenet, and in December of this year, the case of her death will mark 30 years without an arrest, without a trial, and without a name attached to the unidentified DNA that has haunted this investigation since 1997. This is not going to be the version of this story built on rumor, recycled tabloid theories, or forum speculation that has followed this family for 3 decades. This is the story built from official investigative records, court statements, forensic findings that have been confirmed by multiple independent experts, and John Ramsey's own recent public words, examined honestly, without accusation, and without pretending to know more than the evidence actually tells us. Before we go further, if you value coverage of real cases that sticks to documented fact instead of speculation, take a second right now to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what we cover next. And if you're the kind of viewer who wants a fair, evidence-based breakdown rather than another sensationalized rehash, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this kind of reporting reach more people. Now let's get into what actually happened and where this case truly stands today, in 2026. Most people who know this case only through headlines know it as a mystery. Fewer people know it as a family. Before December of 1996, the Ramseys were, by every documented account, an unremarkable success story. John Ramsey had built a technology distribution company that grew into a subsidiary of a major aerospace and defense contractor, and by the mid-1990s, the family was living comfortably in a large home in Boulder, Colorado. His wife Patsy was a former beauty pageant competitor who had stepped away from that world to raise a family. They had 2 children together, a son named Burke and a daughter named JonBenet, born in August of 1990. JonBenet was 6 years old in December of 1996. She was, by the accounts of people who actually knew her, a bright, energetic child who enjoyed performing, who competed in children's pageants with her mother's encouragement, and who by every documented account had an ordinary, happy childhood in the weeks leading up to that Christmas. None of what follows will ever change that basic fact. Before this became one of the most examined criminal cases in American history, JonBenet Ramsey was simply a little girl in Colorado, looking forward to Christmas. On the evening of December 23, 1996, the family hosted a holiday gathering at their home, and later that night attended a second Christmas party with close friends. On Christmas Day, the family stayed home. JonBenet received a bicycle as a gift. By every documented account from people who were with them that evening, it was an unremarkable happy holiday. Nothing about that day suggested anything was coming. Then, in the early hours of December 26th, everything changed. Around 5:30 that morning, Patsy Ramsey woke to prepare for a family trip. When she checked on JonBenet, her daughter was not in her room. Minutes later, on the home staircase, she found a lengthy, handwritten ransom note demanding a sum of money that closely matched a private financial detail from John Ramsey's recent work bonus, and claiming that JonBenet had been taken. The family searched the house and found no trace of her. At 5:52 that morning, Patsy called 911, reporting her daughter missing and describing the note. That 911 call has been analyzed by professionals and amateurs alike for almost 30 years. Some linguistic analysts have pointed to specific word choices and raised questions about them. Other trained experts have cautioned that reading deep meaning into a single emergency call, made by a parent in the middle of unimaginable panic, is inherently limited and has never been treated as conclusive by any court connected to this case. It remains a genuinely debated area, not a settled one, and honest coverage of this case has to say that plainly rather than presenting one interpretation as fact. Police arrived within minutes. An officer conducted an initial walkthrough of the home, checking doors and windows for signs of forced entry and finding none. In the basement, he briefly opened the door to a small storage room used for holiday items, but did not turn on the light or step inside before continuing his search elsewhere in the house. It stands today as one of the most consequential missed moments in the entire case, not because of any documented wrongdoing on the officer's part, but because JonBenet's body was in that room the whole time and would remain there for hours. As the morning went on, the family reached out to close friends who came to the house to offer support and moved through the home before it had been secured as a crime scene. This detail has drawn scrutiny for years because the ransom note explicitly warned against contacting anyone outside the immediate family. Whether that reflected panic and inexperience in an unprecedented crisis or something more deliberate has never been resolved by any investigator, and no direct evidence has ever established which explanation is correct. Around 1 that afternoon, the lead detective on scene asked John Ramsey and a family friend to search the house again, room by room, for anything unusual. They went to the basement. John Ramsey opened the door to that same storage room, and there he found his daughter. In a moment of raw, instinctive grief, he carried her upstairs. That single act, understandable as a father's reaction, was devastating from a forensic standpoint. It disturbed the position of the body and compromised evidence that could never be recovered. The detective who was present that day would later describe in a television interview years afterward a specific impression she formed of John Ramsey's demeanor in that moment, one that left her personally suspicious of his involvement, an impression she has stood by publicly ever since. It is important to say clearly that this was always a subjective, in-the-moment reaction, never corroborated by physical evidence, and that a parent in a state of shock discovering a child's death does not behave according to any predictable script that investigators, or anyone else, can reliably interpret after the fact. The forensic examination conducted the following day determined that JonBenet had died from asphyxiation associated with a significant head injury. The examination also documented findings that investigators have described as evidence consistent with possible assault. Given the sensitive nature of this case, involving a minor victim, the specific clinical details of those findings have remained sealed in court records for nearly 30 years, and this video will not go beyond what has been carefully and officially documented in that regard. The examination also revealed a detail that has puzzled investigators for decades. Partially digested food was found in JonBenet's stomach, suggesting she had eaten sometime in the hours before her death, a detail that conflicted with her parents' account that she had fallen asleep before returning home that night and never woke to eat anything. To this day, no one has ever definitively explained when she ate or who was with her at the time, and it remains one of the case's most persistent, unresolved details. For years afterward, a great deal of public attention turned toward the Ramsey family itself. Some accounts pointed to what investigators described as unusual composure from John Ramsey in the hours after the ransom note was discovered. Others who knew him professionally have described that same composure as consistent with a temperament that stayed measured under extreme pressure. Investigators also raised questions over the years about small inconsistencies in the family's account of that night and the days that followed, differing statements about timing, differing recollections between family members about who first suggested calling police, and a basement window that was found open later that same morning, despite having been checked and found closed hours earlier. These are genuine, documented points that responsible coverage of this case has to acknowledge honestly. It is equally honest to say that inconsistencies in memory are common after any traumatic event, that none of these specific points has ever been established as evidence of wrongdoing, and that no charges have ever been filed against any member of the Ramsey family in connection with this case. Under the law, and in this video, they remain what they have always officially been: not suspects, not defendants, a family that lost a child. It's also worth addressing directly something that has circulated online for years, an elaborate and highly detailed theory from an unverified source claiming a coordinated cover-up involving the entire family. That theory has never been supported by physical evidence, has never appeared in any court proceeding, has never been endorsed by any law enforcement agency connected to this case, and is directly contradicted by the strongest physical evidence investigators actually have. Repeating unverified accusations as though they carry the same weight as documented fact isn't responsible reporting, And we're not going to do that here, because the strongest, most consistently confirmed physical evidence in this case has never pointed toward the people inside that house. It has pointed somewhere else entirely. In 1997, forensic testing identified DNA from an unknown male, mixed with a small amount of blood, in JonBenet's clothing. It did not match John Ramsey. It did not match Patsy. It did not match Burke. It did not match any of the family friends who voluntarily submitted samples during the investigation. Entered into the National Criminal Database, it produced no match. In 2003, newer testing technology, capable of detecting genetic material from mere skin contact, found the same unidentified profile again, this time on a separate piece of JonBenet's clothing. Finding matching DNA from the same unknown source in two different places made an innocent, incidental explanation involving contamination significantly less statistically likely, according to the forensic experts who reviewed the findings. In 2008, the district attorney at the time sent a formal letter to John Ramsey, officially and publicly exonerating the entire Ramsey family based on that evidence, stating plainly that the presence of that DNA in two separate locations pointed to an unknown male having handled JonBenet's clothing, with no innocent explanation available. It remains one of the more significant formal exonerations in modern American criminal justice, delivered in writing by the prosecutor's own office. There is a piece of this story that happened in between those two milestones, in 2006, that deserves its own honest mention, because it shows just how much confusion and misinformation this case has generated over the years, even from official channels. In August of that year, a man living overseas came forward and confessed to being involved in JonBenet's death. He was arrested and extradited back to the United States amid enormous media coverage, with some outlets treating the case as effectively solved before he ever set foot in a courtroom. Within weeks, DNA testing excluded him entirely as the source of the male genetic material found on JonBenet's clothing, and prosecutors declined to file any charges against him, citing significant inconsistencies between his account and the documented facts of the case. It remains one of the clearest illustrations of how this investigation has been shaped, again and again, by intense public pressure for resolution colliding with evidence that simply didn't support the conclusions people wanted to reach. Patsy Ramsey had died of cancer just 2 months before that false confession made headlines, meaning she spent her final months still officially unexonerated, watching the case generate yet another round of national attention that ultimately led nowhere. Some officials in the years since have taken a more cautious position, noting that while the family isn't actively considered under suspicion, DNA evidence alone hasn't been treated by every subsequent prosecutor as an absolute, permanently case-closing conclusion. That tension between what the science has repeatedly suggested and what institutions have been formally willing to declare with total finality has defined the modern chapter of this case for close to 2 decades. It's also fair to note that this evidence has been reviewed by numerous independent forensic experts over the years, several of whom have concluded it likely belongs to whoever was actually responsible, while a small number of others have raised alternative explanations involving possible contamination during manufacturing. The complexity of the sample has made a fully unanimous interpretation difficult, and this remains one of the more actively debated technical questions in the entire case, even now, in 2026. Beyond the DNA, other physical evidence collected at the scene has fueled discussion for decades. A basement window was found broken, with a suitcase positioned beneath it, something one veteran investigator described as a possible point of entry. Though undisturbed cobwebs around the window frame led Boulder police to believe it hadn't been recently used, John Ramsey's own acknowledgement that he had broken that same window himself months earlier, after being locked out of the house, complicated interpretation of that detail considerably. Investigators also documented an unidentified boot print in the basement, an unidentified hair found on the blanket covering JonBenet, and a length of rope that didn't belong to any member of the household, found in a nearby room. None of these individual details has ever been conclusively tied to a specific person. But taken together, they have kept the possibility of someone outside the household being responsible a serious, evidence-supported line of inquiry throughout the life of this investigation, not merely a hypothetical. After the formal exoneration in 2008, John Ramsey largely stepped back from the public spotlight that had defined the previous decade of his life. But the years that followed brought further loss. His wife Patsy died of ovarian cancer in 2006, 2 years before that exoneration letter arrived, meaning she never lived to see her name formally and publicly cleared by the same evidence her husband had spent years fighting to have properly tested. Combined with the earlier loss of his eldest daughter Elizabeth in a car accident in 1992, John Ramsey had now buried 2 daughters and a wife within a decade and a half. He eventually left Boulder, a city he came to associate almost entirely with grief and public scrutiny, remarried in 2011, and built a quieter, more private life, largely outside of public view. In 2012, he published a memoir reflecting not primarily on the investigation itself, but on the broader experience of surviving repeated loss and years of public suspicion. Throughout that quieter period, he continued, consistently but far more privately, to advocate for advanced DNA testing and for legislative reform that would give other families of unsolved homicide victims a formal path to demand renewed investigation, advocacy that helped contribute to cold case review legislation passed in Colorado in 2013. That quiet period did not mean the case disappeared from public life. Through the 2010s, JonBenet's death remained a fixture of American true crime culture, revisited in television specials, documentary series, and countless amateur investigations online, many of which recycled the same unverified theories year after year, with little regard for what had actually been established or ruled out. A televised special in 2016 built around a staged reconstruction of events drew significant criticism from forensic professionals for presenting speculative scenarios as though they carried investigative weight. John Ramsey has spoken publicly, more than once, about how exhausting it has been to watch his family's tragedy repackaged as entertainment, often by people with no direct knowledge of the case file, while the actual investigation quietly continued in the background with far less fanfare. In late 2024, a 3-part documentary series revisited the case again, this time built more explicitly around interviews with investigators and family members, and a critical look at the mistakes made during the original response, reflecting a broader shift in how this case has come to be discussed publicly, less as a whodunit puzzle for amateur sleuths, and more as a case study in what can go wrong when a crime scene isn't secured properly. That shift in tone has coincided with, and arguably helped fuel, the renewed institutional attention the case has received over the past 2 years. But over roughly the past 2 years, that quiet advocacy has become loud again, and this is really where the current chapter of this story picks up. Beginning in early 2025, John Ramsey started meeting personally and repeatedly with Boulder's police leadership, describing those conversations as more sincere and more encouraging than anything he had experienced with the department in years. Around the same time, his son publicly revealed that the unidentified male DNA recovered from JonBenet's clothing had still never been run through forensic genetic genealogy, the same category of technique that helped identify the Golden State Killer in 2018, after more than 4 decades. According to the family, existing samples hadn't previously been considered sufficient for that specific kind of genealogical processing, and investigators have said they've continued watching the technology closely, waiting for it to become capable of working with what has already been preserved. Since then, John Ramsey has grown increasingly public and increasingly direct in pushing for exactly that kind of testing to finally be applied. He has said publicly, repeatedly, that he believes investigators already have the responsible party's genetic material, and that what's missing isn't evidence. It's the specific advanced technique needed to turn that evidence into a name. He has argued that local and state agencies may not currently have the specialized tools or personnel to perform this kind of advanced genetic genealogy work themselves, and has pushed for the evidence to be sent instead to independent private laboratories with track records of solving decades-old cold cases elsewhere in the country. In 2022, he circulated a petition that gathered more than 16,000 signatures calling on Colorado officials to authorize exactly that kind of independent testing. Boulder police have confirmed, in their most recent annual updates on the case, that dozens of items connected to the investigation, some retested using modern DNA methods, and some tested for the very first time, are currently being examined at state and outside laboratories. Investigators have said this includes both previously analyzed evidence being revisited with newer technology and crime scene material that had never undergone forensic testing at all. As of the most recent public statements available, results from that expanded testing were still pending, with no publicly confirmed identification announced. Then, in the middle of this ongoing effort, a completely separate story intersected with this case in an unsettling way. A former Colorado Bureau of Investigation forensic analyst who had worked at the agency for decades pleaded guilty in 2026 to multiple felony charges connected to manipulating DNA results and mishandling evidence across more than 1,000 cases spanning nearly 2 decades of her employment. Because she had worked at the agency during the years JonBenet's case was originally processed, the news immediately and understandably raised public questions about whether this specific investigation might have been affected. Both Boulder Police and the Boulder County District Attorney's Office responded directly, stating that after reviewing the case's evidentiary records, they found no indication that analyst had personally handled the evidence connected to JonBenet's death. According to both agencies, the earliest and most forensically significant DNA testing in this case was actually conducted by an independent private laboratory, not by the state agency at the center of that scandal. John Ramsey has publicly confirmed this aligns with what his family has long understood to be true. Still, for a family that has spent nearly 30 years simply trying to get evidence properly tested by institutions they can trust, the scale and timing of that scandal added yet another layer of frustration to an already exhausting fight. It's worth taking a moment to explain, in plain terms, why this specific technology matters so much to this specific case. Standard DNA testing, the kind used throughout most of this investigation, works by comparing a genetic sample directly against known individuals or against profiles already sitting in criminal databases. If the person responsible has never been arrested for anything else, never had their DNA collected for an unrelated case, that kind of testing can confirm a sample doesn't match a suspect, but it can't tell investigators who the sample does belong to. Forensic genetic genealogy works differently. It compares crime scene DNA against public genealogy databases, the same kind of databases ordinary people use to research their own family trees, to identify distant relatives of the unknown person, and then uses traditional genealogical research, building out family trees, cross-referencing records to narrow that list of relatives down to a single likely individual. It is the technique that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 after more than 40 years, and it has since helped resolve dozens of other cold cases across the country, some considerably older than this one. For a case built around a single, consistently confirmed, unidentified male profile with no match in any existing criminal database, it represents, at least in theory, one of the only realistic remaining paths to an identification. This past year, forensic genealogy experts from outside the case have also entered the public conversation directly. Specialists in the field, including leadership at private DNA laboratories that have helped resolve other high-profile cold cases, have publicly stated that the evidence available in JonBenet's case appears well-suited to genetic genealogy testing, and have urged investigators to formally submit it. In interviews given late last year and earlier this year, John Ramsey has echoed that same urgency, stating his belief that this specific technology, if properly applied, could realistically identify his daughter's killer within a matter of months rather than years. It's important to be clear that this is his stated personal belief and hope, based on conversations with forensic experts, not a confirmed outcome or an official timeline from law enforcement. Last year, in one of the more striking moves of this entire chapter, John Ramsey publicly appealed directly to the President of the United States, asking for federal attention and support in pushing his daughter's case towards some kind of resolution after nearly 30 years. It's a request that reflects both real urgency and real accumulated frustration, built up over decades of institutional delay and repeated procedural setbacks. He is now 82 years old, and he has said plainly, in interview after interview, that his one remaining goal is simply to know who did this before he dies. So, what does all of this recent, very public activity actually tell us, once you step back from the noise? It tells us that the man once treated by parts of the public and media as the prime suspect in his own daughter's death has, for nearly 2 decades now, been formally cleared by consistent, independently confirmed DNA evidence, and has spent the years since not avoiding scrutiny, but actively and increasingly publicly pushing for the exact scientific tools that could finally identify the person actually responsible. That is a meaningfully different picture than the one painted by sensationalized coverage in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and it's worth sitting with that honestly, rather than defaulting to old, disproven assumptions. Independent investigators who have reviewed this case in depth over the years, including veteran homicide detectives and criminal profilers, brought in specifically to examine the evidence with fresh eyes, have stated their own professional conclusion that the evidence, taken as a whole, points towards someone outside the household. These are informed assessments based on their own review of the case file, not proven legal fact, and it's important to present them as exactly that, because no trial connected to this case has ever taken place. None of this erases the genuinely difficult, unresolved questions that still sit at the center of this case. Why did a ransom note contain a figure that closely matched a private financial detail almost no one outside the family would have known? Why was there no clear evidence of forced entry into the home? These are the same open questions that have defined serious, credible examination of this case for nearly 30 years, and John Ramsey himself has never claimed to have definitive answers to them either. What he has consistently said is that he believes the answer sits inside that unidentified DNA profile, and that modern technology, fully and finally applied, could provide it once and for all. As of this year, Boulder police continue to describe the investigation as an active, ongoing departmental priority, with detectives stating they continue reviewing evidence and monitoring advances in DNA technology as they become available. But no arrest has been made. No individual has been formally named as a suspect. The unidentified male DNA recovered in 1997 and confirmed again in 2003 still has not been publicly confirmed to have completed the specific forensic genetic genealogy process that has already helped resolve dozens of similarly old cold cases elsewhere in the country, some considerably older than this one. There is one more piece of this story worth acknowledging honestly, because it reflects something genuinely constructive that emerged from decades of documented investigative failure. The mishandling of the crime scene in this case, the delay in securing it, the friends and family allowed to move freely through the home in those early hours. The missed room in that first basement search became, in the years that followed, a widely cited case study in law enforcement training programs across the country. Departments nationwide have since adopted stricter crime scene protocols, emphasizing immediate lockdowns to preserve evidence, improved coordination between local police, federal agencies, and forensic labs, and specific training aimed at avoiding the kind of early tunnel vision that shaped so much of this investigation's difficult first years. John Ramsey's own advocacy work has directly contributed to legislative reform, including Colorado's cold case review law, giving other families of unsolved homicide victims a formal path to request renewed investigation that didn't exist before. Whatever remains unresolved about this specific case, its documented failures have measurably improved how other cases get investigated since. JonBenét Ramsey would be 36 years old this year. Her father, now in his 80s, has outlived his wife, 2 of his daughters, and decades of public suspicion that the physical evidence has never actually supported. What he has not outlived is the wait for an answer. Nearly 30 years after that Christmas morning in Boulder, John Ramsey is still here, still asking the same question he asked in 1996, and for the first time in years, doing so louder, more publicly, and with what he himself describes as genuine, cautious hope that modern science might finally deliver the answer that decades of investigation, speculation, and personal heartbreak never could. If this case affected you the way it has affected millions of people over nearly 3 decades, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you catch our continued coverage as new developments come in. Hit that like button if you believe cases like this one deserve real answers built on actual evidence, not decades of recycled speculation. And I'd genuinely like to know, after hearing this laid out plainly, has your view of this case shifted at all? Do you believe the technology now exists to finally solve it? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've followed this case for years, let me know what detail you think investigators still haven't fully explained. Underneath every headline, every documentary, and every theory this case has generated over the last 3 decades, there is a real family that has lived through repeated, devastating loss, and years of public scrutiny that was never matched by the kind of definitive evidence that would normally justify it. JonBenét Ramsey was a real 6-year-old girl whose life was taken far too soon, inside her own home, during what should have been one of the safest weeks of the year. Her father has spent nearly 30 years refusing to stop asking who did it, even as he outlived nearly everyone else he loved along the way. The technology to finally answer that question may already exist. The only remaining question, the one that will define whatever comes next in this case, is whether it will finally be used. Evidence speaks, and when this case is finally solved, we'll be here to deliver the verdict. Thank you for watching. See you in the next investigation.